In the year 500 BCE, as the morning mist lifted from the Yellow River Valley, a teacher sat beneath an ancient mulberry tree, surrounded by eager students. When approached by yet another young man seeking wisdom, the master shook his head gently. "I do not open up the truth to one who is not eager to get knowledge," he declared, "nor help out anyone who is not anxious to explain himself." These words, spoken by Confucius to the world as Confucius, would echo through 25 centuries, shaping the educational philosophy of the world's most populous civilization and influencing over 2 billion lives. To understand China, one must understand Confucius, and to understand Confucius, one must grasp why this revolutionary teacher refused to instruct those who lacked the burning desire to learn. In classrooms from Beijing to Boston, in boardrooms from Shanghai to Silicon Valley, the Confucian approach to education continues to shape how knowledge is transmitted, received, and valued. This is the story of how one man's insistence on student initiative transformed not just Chinese education, but the very concept of learning itself. The bronze bells of the Zhou dynasty temples had long fallen silent when Confucius was born in 551 BCE in the small state of Lu, in what is now Shandong province. The once mighty Zhou dynasty was crumbling, its feudal system collapsing into what historians would later call the Spring and Autumn Period, an era marked by political chaos, social upheaval, and endless warfare between competing states. In the marketplaces of Khufu, merchants whispered of armies on the march, of alliances broken as quickly as they were made, of the old rituals and ceremonies abandoned in favor of raw power and military might. Professor Wang Defeng of Beijing Normal University explains it vividly. Imagine living in a world where everything your grandparents believed in was falling apart. The social fabric was tearing. Rulers were assassinating their fathers, ministers were overthrowing their lords, and the common people suffered under the weight of constant warfare and taxation. This was the world that gave birth to Confucius. Into this chaos was born a child, whose father, Shuliang He, was a minor military officer who died when Confucius was only 3 years old. His mother, Yan Zhengzai, was left to raise the boy in poverty, moving from their ancestral home to the humble neighborhoods near the capital of Lu. The stone-paved streets where young Confucius played were narrow and crowded, filled with the sounds of craftsmen hammering bronze, vendors hawking their wares, and occasionally the thunder of cavalry horses as another military expedition passed through. Despite their poverty, or perhaps because of it, Yan Zhengzai instilled in her son an unquenchable thirst for learning. "My mother," Confucius would later recall, "though we had little, made sure I understood that knowledge was the one treasure that could never be stolen." She scraped together enough money to provide him with a basic education, teaching him to read the ancient texts by the light of oil lamps that flickered in their modest dwelling. Dr. Liu Xiaogan, a philosopher at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, notes, "What's remarkable about Confucius' early life is how he transformed deprivation into determination. He couldn't afford formal schooling, so he educated himself. He couldn't access the royal archives, so he sought out anyone who could teach him something: musicians, ritual specialists, even common craftsmen." By the age of 15, Confucius had already declared his heart was set upon learning. Ziyu shui, ziyu shui. He took whatever humble jobs he could find, keeping accounts at a granary, tending cattle, but always with books secreted in his robes, reading during every spare moment. The young man would stand outside the homes of scholars, listening to their discussions, memorizing every word. When ritual ceremonies were performed at the local temples, he would position himself where he could observe every gesture, every movement, burning the details into his memory. At 19, he married a woman from the Qiguan family and soon had a son, Kong Li. The responsibilities of family life only intensified his desire to understand the principles that could bring order to a chaotic world. He began to attract his first students, young men who, like him, believed that somewhere in the wisdom of the past lay the keys to a better future. The concept of selective teaching emerged from Confucius's own struggle to acquire knowledge. Having fought so hard for every scrap of learning, he understood that education was not something to be passively received, but actively pursued. The Chinese phrase bu fen bu qi captures this perfectly. If a student is not frustrated and struggling, I will not open the door. Master Chen, a contemporary Confucian teacher at the Beijing Confucius Temple, explains the philosophy. When Confucius said, "I never teach those who don't want to learn," he wasn't being elitist or cruel. He was recognizing a fundamental truth about human nature. The mind is like a locked door. The teacher can show you where the door is, but only the student can turn the key from the inside. The character for teaching in classical Chinese, Jiao, combines the elements of child and stick, suggesting the old model of education through force and punishment. But Confucius revolutionized this concept. His method, which he called Yin Kai Shi Jiao, teaching according to individual aptitude, required students to first demonstrate their readiness to learn. In the Analects, Confucius elaborates on his method. If I hold up one corner of a square and a student cannot come back to me with the other 3 corners, I do not continue the lesson. This wasn't harsh dismissal, but profound pedagogy. He understood that true learning occurs when the student's mind actively engages with the material, making connections, seeing patterns, discovering truths for themselves. Dr. Roger Ames, a sinologist at the University of Hawaii, provides modern context. What Confucius understood 2,500 years ago, modern neuroscience confirms today. Active learning, where students struggle with concepts, make mistakes, and discover solutions, creates far deeper neural pathways than passive reception of information. The frustration Confucius required wasn't sadism. It was the cognitive struggle, necessary for genuine understanding. The sage developed several key concepts that would define his educational philosophy for millennia. The first was shui shi ji, to learn and at due times practice what one has learned. This wasn't rote memorization but embodied knowledge, where learning transformed into lived experience. Students were expected to take what they learned in morning discussions and apply it to their afternoon activities, whether in government service, family relations, or personal cultivation. The second principle was ren, often translated as benevolence or humaneness. The character combines person and two, suggesting human relationships. But Confucius refused to give a single, simple definition of ren. When different students asked about it, he gave different answers, each tailored to what that particular student needed to understand at that moment in their development. To the rash and impulsive Zilu, he emphasized restraint and reflection. To the overly cautious Ran Qiu, he stressed courage and action. The third cornerstone was Li, ritual propriety or proper conduct. In Confucius's time, the ancient rituals of the Zhou dynasty were being abandoned or corrupted. He saw in these rituals not empty formalism, but a technology for creating harmony between heaven and earth, between ruler and subject, between individuals in society. The incense smoke curling around ancient bronze vessels, the precise movements of the ritual dancers, the haunting melodies of the stone chimes, all. These were teaching tools that helped students understand their place in the cosmic and social order. Professor Tu Weiming of Harvard University explains, when Confucius spoke of ritual, he wasn't advocating blind conformity. He was teaching a form of social choreography, how human beings could move together in harmony without losing their individuality. But this could only be learned by those who actively engaged with the practice, not those who merely watched from the sidelines. The fourth principle was junzi, the ideal of the gentleman or exemplary person. This wasn't about social class but moral cultivation. The junzi was someone who had internalized wisdom to the point where right action flowed naturally, like water finding its course. But becoming a junzi required intense self-cultivation, constant reflection, and the willingness to confront one's own shortcomings. During Confucius's lifetime, his ideas met with limited success. He spent 14 years wandering from state to state, seeking a ruler who would implement his vision of governance through virtue rather than force. The dusty roads between kingdoms were dangerous, filled with bandits and deserting soldiers. More than once, Confucius and his disciples faced starvation, imprisonment, and threats to their lives. In the state of Chen, they were surrounded by hostile forces and ran out of food. As his disciples grew weak from hunger, some began to question their master's teachings. Zilu, always the most direct, confronted Confucius. "Does the Yunzi also experience such hardship?" Confucius replied, playing his chin, seven-stringed zither, with calm determination. "The Junzi may indeed experience hardship, but unlike the petty person, he does not allow hardship to overwhelm him." It was during these trials that Confucius' philosophy of selective teaching proved its worth. Only those students who truly burned with the desire to learn remained with him through the fair weather followers. Those who sought easy wisdom or quick advancement fell away like autumn leaves. What remained was a core group of devoted disciples who would carry his teachings forward. Dr. Sarah Allen of Dartmouth College observes, "The wandering years were Confucius's crucible. They transformed his teaching from theoretical philosophy to lived wisdom. His students weren't learning in comfortable academies, but on dangerous roads, in hostile courts, through genuine adversity. This experiential education created disciples who didn't just know Confucian principles, but embodied them. When Confucius finally returned to Lu in his late 60s, he devoted his remaining years to teaching and editing the classical texts. The school he established became legendary. Under the spreading branches of the apricot trees, Xingtan, which became a symbol for education itself, students from all social classes gathered to learn. Rich and poor sat side by side, for Confucius had declared, "In education, there should be no class distinctions. You jiao wu lei. Yet even with this egalitarian approach, he maintained his principle of teaching only those who demonstrated genuine desire to learn. The evening discussions would begin with Confucius sitting in silence, waiting. Only when a student, driven by genuine curiosity or struggling with a real problem, asked a question would the teaching begin. The crackling of the fire, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of bamboo in the night wind, all provided the backdrop for dialogues that would shape civilization. After Confucius died in 479 BCE, his disciples scattered across China, each carrying forward different aspects of his teaching. Mengzi would develop the concept of innate human goodness, while Zunzi would argue for the need to reshape human nature through education. But all maintained the master's insistence on active, engaged learning. The Han Dynasty, 206 BCE and 220 CE, marked the official adoption of Confucianism as state ideology. Emperor Wu established the Imperial Academy, where the classics were taught to future government officials. The stone tablets of the academy, carved with Confucian texts, became pilgrimage sites for scholars. The examination system, based on mastery of Confucian texts, would eventually become the world's first meritocracy, allowing even peasants' sons to rise to the highest ranks of government through educational achievement. Professor Zhang Denian of Peking University notes, The examination system embodied Confucius's principle perfectly. You couldn't buy your way to success or rely on family connections. You had to demonstrate genuine learning, the kind that comes only from deep personal engagement with the texts. The system had its flaws, certainly, but for over 1,000 years it provided social mobility through education, a revolutionary concept. Through the Tang and Song dynasties, Confucian educational principles spread throughout East Asia. In Japan, the samurai class adopted Confucian learning as essential to warrior cultivation. In Korea, the Joseon dynasty created perhaps the most thoroughly Confucian society in history, with village schools teaching the analects to farmers' children. In Vietnam, Confucian temples became centers of learning, where the principles of active engagement with knowledge were passed down through generations. The great Neo-Confucian philosopher Zhu Xi, 1130 to 1200, systematized Confucian education into a comprehensive curriculum. His 4 books, the Analects, Mencius, the Great Learning, and the Doctrine of the Mean, became the core texts for 8 centuries of East Asian education. But Zhu Xi also emphasized Confucius's original insight. Reading without thinking is useless. Thinking without reading is dangerous. 学而不思则罔，思而不学则殆，学而不思则罔，思而不学则殆. Today, in the gleaming classrooms of Beijing's top universities, in the traditional academies of Seoul, in the international schools of Singapore, Confucian educational principles continue to shape how knowledge is transmitted. The emphasis on student initiative, on learning through struggle, on the integration of knowledge and virtue, remains remarkably relevant in the 21st century. At Confucius Institute headquarters in Beijing, Director Liu Yan explains the modern application. We see it clearly in comparative education studies. East Asian students consistently outperform others in international assessments. It's not because they're naturally smarter. It's because they've internalized Confucius's principle that learning requires active engagement, persistent effort, and genuine desire. In Shanghai's business district, CEO Zhang Wei of a major technology company describes how Confucian principles shape corporate training. We don't spoon-feed our employees. Following Confucius, we present challenges and wait for them to struggle, to ask questions, to seek solutions. Only then do we provide guidance. This creates innovators, not just followers. The principle extends beyond formal education. In family settings across China, parents still practice qi fa shi jiao, qi fa shi jiao shui, heuristic teaching that guides children to discover answers for themselves rather than simply providing them. At dinner tables from Beijing to San Francisco, Chinese parents ask their children not, "What did you learn today?" but "What questions did you ask today?" Dr. Amy Chua of Yale Law School, author of Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, reflects on the cultural transmission, the Western stereotype of Asian education as rote memorization misses the Confucian essence entirely. Yes, there's emphasis on practice and repetition, but the goal is to internalize knowledge so deeply that it becomes second nature, freeing the mind for creative application. You can't get there without the students' active participation. In modern Chinese schools, the ancient principle manifests in teaching methods that would seem foreign to Western educators. Teachers often begin classes with prolonged silence, waiting for students to voice their confusion or curiosity. Mathematics instructors present problems without immediately explaining solution methods, forcing students to struggle and discover patterns for themselves. Literature teachers assign classical texts without modern translations, requiring students to grapple with the original language until meaning emerges. Miss Chen Xiaomei, a high school teacher in Chengdu, describes her approach. "When I teach the In the Lex, I don't explain what Confucius meant. I wait for students to be puzzled, to argue with each other, to come to me with their frustrations. Only then, when their minds are like tilled soil ready for planting, do I offer my insights. And often their questions lead to understandings I hadn't considered myself. The technology age has brought new challenges and opportunities for Confucian education. Online learning platforms in China now use AI to detect when students are genuinely struggling with concepts versus simply clicking through materials. The algorithms wait for signs of active engagement, repeated attempts, varied approaches, help-seeking behavior before providing hints or solutions. Professor Li Zehu, a philosopher at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, sees deep continuity. Confucius would have loved modern educational technology, not for its efficiency, but for its ability to personalize learning. His method of teaching different students differently, of waiting for the right moment of readiness, can now be scaled to millions through adaptive learning systems. The contemporary revival of Confucian education extends beyond Asia. In New York City's Chinatown, weekend Chinese schools teach not just language, but Confucian values. In Silicon Valley, tech entrepreneurs study the analects for insights into leadership and innovation. At Harvard Business School, case studies explore how Confucian principles of continuous learning and self-cultivation drive Asian economic success. Dr. Michael Puett, who teaches Harvard's third most popular course on Chinese philosophy, observes, "My students are initially frustrated when I refuse to give them clear definitions or simple answers. But by semester's end, they understand. The struggle to comprehend is itself the learning." Confucius knew that wisdom isn't a product to be delivered, but a capacity to be developed. The living legacy of Confucius's selective teaching appears vividly during the annual Teachers' Day celebrations across East Asia. In Seoul's Sungkyunkwan University, students in traditional hanbok perform the ancient ritual of bowing to their teachers, not in submission, but in recognition of the sacred relationship between one who seeks knowledge and one who guides the seeking. The aroma of incense mingles with the sound of ancient instruments as modern students honor the 2,500-year tradition. In rural Shandong province, near Confucius's birthplace, village schools maintain the tradition of the apricot altar. Under flowering apricot trees, descendants of those that shaded Confucius, elderly teachers gather with young students for informal discussions. The teaching begins only when a child, driven by curiosity about the world, asks the first question. Master Wang, age 82, who has taught in the village for 60 years, embodies the tradition. "I've seen thousands of students. The ones who succeed aren't always the smartest. They're the ones who come with questions burning in their hearts, who won't accept easy answers, who struggle with ideas like Jacob wrestling with the angel. These are the ones Confucius would have welcomed to his school." The global financial business schools from London to Singapore began incorporating Confucian texts into their curricula, recognizing that sustainable success requires the kind of deep learning that comes only from genuine engagement. In Tokyo's Keio University, Professor Tanaka Yuki explains, "The crisis showed the danger of superficial learning, people who knew all the formulas but didn't understand the principles. Confucius's insistence on struggling with ideas until they become part of you. This creates the kind of judgment that can navigate uncertainty." Modern neuroscience has validated Confucius's insights with remarkable precision. Brain imaging studies show that active learning, the kind that involves struggle, mistakes, and eventual breakthrough, creates more robust neural networks than passive reception. The anterior cingulate cortex, which fires during cognitive conflict, appears to be crucial for deep learning. Confucius couldn't have known the neurology, but he understood the psychology perfectly. Dr. Barbara Oakley, author of Learning How. To learn connects ancient wisdom with modern science. When Confucius refused to teach students who weren't ready to learn, he was recognizing what we now call the generation effect, the fact that knowledge we struggle to acquire stays with us far longer than information simply given to us. The frustration he required wasn't cruelty, but kindness, ensuring his students would retain what they learned. As evening falls over the Confucius temple in Khufu, thousands of tourists and pilgrims pass through the ancient gates. But in a quiet corner, away from the crowds, a small group of students gathers with their teacher. They sit in silence, waiting. Finally, one young woman speaks. "Teacher, I've been struggling with the concept of Ren. The more I study it, the less I understand." The teacher smiles. This is the moment Confucius waited for, the moment when genuine learning can begin. The principle of teaching only those who want to learn challenges modern educational assumptions about universal access and standardized instruction. Yet it speaks to a deeper truth about human nature and the learning process. In an age of information overload, when knowledge is a mere click away, Confucius's insight becomes more relevant than ever. Wisdom cannot be downloaded. It must be cultivated through personal struggle and genuine engagement. As we stand at the threshold of an AI-driven future, where machines can process information faster than any human, the Confucian emphasis on cultivating wisdom over accumulating facts becomes crucial. The jobs of tomorrow will require not those who can memorize and repeat, but those who can think, adapt, and create. Capacities that develop only through the kind of active learning Confucius championed. The sage who refused to teach those who didn't want to learn wasn't building barriers but opening doors. Doors that could only be opened from the inside by students ready to transform themselves through education. In boardrooms and classrooms, in families and communities around the world, this 2,500-year-old wisdom continues to shape how we understand the sacred relationship between teacher and student, between knowledge and wisdom, between learning and living. As the stars appear over the yellow river valley, in the same sky Confucius contemplated, his words echo across the centuries. Is one human being different from another? It is in education that they diverge, but that education, transformative and profound, remains available only to those who truly desire it, who come with questions rather than waiting for answers, who understand that the struggle to learn is itself the first and most important lesson. The bronze bells of the Confucius temple ring out across Khufu, their sound carrying the same message they have proclaimed for millennia. Wisdom awaits those who seek it, but only those who truly seek will find. In this age of instant information and artificial intelligence, Confucius's ancient insight remains startlingly modern. The best teachers still wait for the moment when the student is ready, and the best students still understand that learning requires not passive reception but active engagement, not comfortable certainty but productive struggle, not the mere desire for credentials but the burning need to understand.